to start us off with a quick introduction, I'm Louisa Carlser and Director of Partnerships at TecEx Medical. So just for those that do not work with TecEx Medical already at this stage or who aren't partnered with us, TecEx Medical is a specialized importer of record provider. We essentially focus on clinical trials and supporting our sponsors, CROs, and vendor partners with importing their various types of commodities for the use in a clinical trial. And I'm specifically responsible for managing these partnerships. And I'm also joined today by Monique Meyer, and she will be my partner in crime to help talk a little bit more about taxes and tariffs and shed some light on the recent changes.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be with you all this afternoon.
Great. So we are going to look just at the following agenda. We're going to speak a bit more just about, first of all, explaining what are the differences between an import tax, a tariff, and then also looking at what specifically is a trade war. And then we'll go into just an overview of what the latest changes have been, especially following from the recent announcements from the Trump administration, and then looking at a worked example of what that typically will look like on a commodity that's being imported for a clinical trial. We'll also then assess what commodities are affected at this stage or will be implicated by these tariffs, and also some that are still exempt at this stage. So this is particularly important for some of the larger studies, the global studies that may have a cost impact, to know which ones at this time may be impacted. And then we'll also look at some of the implications, so things to be aware of when you are currently running a global trial or you are in the startup phase of a new trial, what some of those implications will be, and then some practical considerations of what you should be looking out for those trials. All right, so Monique will kick us off and dive right into, first of all, explaining a bit more about import taxes. And just before we get going, do feel free to put any questions through to us. If there is time at the end of the 30 minutes, we'll address some of the questions. Alternatively, we will also share our contact details. You can reach out to us, and we're more than happy to have a discussion around this topic.
Perfect. Thank you, Louisa. So as Louisa mentioned, to kick things off today, we will start with a very brief introduction of taxes, tariffs, duties, and then trade wars. So starting us off with import VAT or GST, also known as value-added taxes or goods and services tax. This is a tax that is being imposed on goods that are being imported into a country. So it is a consumption tax, essentially. The purpose of import VAT or the GST is to ensure that goods that are being imported are treated similarly to goods that are being produced domestically in a country, and help to maintain that tax neutrality. So as well to also just generate some revenue for governments, as with all taxes, tariffs, and duties. So a specific example of import VAT is when you are, for example, importing investigational medicinal products, so your drug product into Germany. Germany has an import VAT rate of 19%. So what will happen if you are importing investigational drugs that are valued at 100,000 euros, you will incur import VAT of 19,000 euros on that importation. In a lot of countries, and depending on the organization's tax structure and the country's legislation, import VAT can be recoverable at a later stage. And this is something that we highly recommend you to take up with either your importer or your IRR service provider or your broker to make sure that taxes are recovered where possible.
Great, thanks, Monique. So then what is the difference between an import tax, such as a VAT, a GST, a MUMS? There are various different conventions on import tax, but then we also have import duties. So a duty is an additional tax that is added. So you will have your import VAT or your import GST, but then you'll also have an import duty rate that's applicable. An import duty is applied or calculated based on the type of commodity you're importing, as well as then the country. So different countries have different duties applicable on certain commodities. And this is where the HS code that you are assigning or how you are classifying that commodity is very important, because that HS code will drive what this duty rate will be when importing into a specific country. Now, import duties are generally applied to protect some form of a domestic industry or a part of a domestic industry in a country. For example, certain countries like Brazil, for example, have a very strong textile industry. So they apply heavy duties or high duty rates on any form of a product being of textile nature. So if we also then look at an example here on the duty, so let's say you are a US sponsor and you are importing lab equipment from the UK to be used in a clinical trial, and the applicable duty rate for that commodity code or that HS code is calculated at 4%. So if you are doing a bulk import of $200,000, then $8,000 will be applicable in duties, and that will be payable at time of clearance. So that's the implication of a duty rate. Now, in light of the changes and the recent announcements by the Trump administration, a lot of our clients have been asking quite a bit about import tariffs and what this is and how is this different, and then also what is the implication of this. Now, an import tariff is separate from a duty. It's another or an additional tax that's imposed. In some cases, it could be a temporary tax or a tax that is applied for a certain period of time or on a specific type of commodity. It usually is brought into play either from a political perspective, so where there's, let's say, a country or two or more countries not in agreement in terms of where their trade balance is at, or it could be a case where there is an actual trade imbalance between different countries. And this is the argument that the US is making currently between their trade imbalance and the rest of the countries that they are doing business with. And we'll speak about those different tariffs that's being implemented as well. But I've listed a couple of the purpose or the reasons for why tariffs can be imposed on the slide there. And one good example here to kind of reference the current US-China situation. If we, let's say, have the geopolitical tension, and let's say we have the US imposing a 25% tariff on Chinese manufactured API, so active pharmaceutical ingredients. And if the CRO, let's say, looks to import $500,000 worth of APIs from China, then on a shipment worth of $500,000, you'll be paying an additional $125,000. And we'll show this in a bit more detail and a bit more specific based on the baseline tariff and the reciprocal tariffs that was specifically introduced by Trump. But this is just to give an overview of what's the difference between your import VAT or your import GST, what is an import duty, and what is an import tariff, and how that can be applied, or how to understand the structure of these taxes when you're dealing with international shipments in your clinical trial.
Great. Thank you, Louisa. If we then look further into a trade war and specifically what is a trade war and why are they implemented, a trade war is basically an economic conflict between two countries. So they originate either because of trade imbalances, trade deficits, national security concerns, or any political or strategic conflicts. And basically where these imbalances or deficits arise, then a country tries to protect their domestic industries, and then a trade war or an economic conflict exists from there. So that is usually where, let's say, more of a specific product is being imported into a country than what is being manufactured locally. And then that country will impose tariffs or other trade barriers or restrictions on importation for that product to basically boost the domestic industry and give the domestic industry a chance to also produce more products and sell those products in the domestic market. So if we look at a few current relevances of trade wars, we currently have the US-China trade war that has been ongoing since 2018. And that actually started under the initial Trump administration, where there was a concern of intellectual property theft. But that has also since evolved from the intellectual property theft control or concern to a trade imbalance concern, as well as there's a lot of products that are being imported from China that could also be manufactured in the US, and Trump would rather boost the domestic manufacturing of those products. So then there's specific tariffs and trade barriers that are being put on imports into China, specifically when we look at the electronics industry, for example. Then we also have the China and the EU friction that has been going on since 2018. And this friction also originated because of the fact that European companies, when they do business in China, they are very highly regulated and sometimes even restricted, whereas Chinese companies can freely operate within the European Union. And this caused a lot of friction on the European Union's end, and especially recently looking at three main categories where the European Union is concerned for the unfairly subsidized electric vehicles, so the EVs that are manufactured in China. That's a big concern for the European Union. Then also looking at medical devices and pharmaceuticals. China has an export dominance, especially in our industry, as they do manufacture quite a lot of the medical devices and the pharmaceuticals that are being used. And then lastly, when looking at your green technologies, China is also manufacturing solar panels and batteries at a really low cost, and Europe fears that their markets will be flooded by these low cost green technologies. And as a result, the friction has arisen. And then another current relevance of trade wars is the China-India war. India has taken a little bit of a protectionist turn in the long-standing tension that has been ongoing between China and India. So India is also aiming to become a hub for biotech and pharmaceutical, and then also your electronic manufacturers. And they are setting up strategic alliances with the US and Europe, for example, to be able to support these countries with these types of products. So yeah, that's currently where trade wars, how they originate and why they exist, and the relevance of those that's currently ongoing.
Right. Thanks, Monique. So that brings us to the actual Liberation Day happenings that occurred technically on the 2nd of April, but was declared, or April 5th being declared as Liberation Day by President Trump. So essentially what happened, if you have not followed any of the news clips or any of the news announcements in April, was that the Trump administration initiated this dual tariff structure, or a two-tiered tariff system that essentially includes a baseline tariff that's additionally applied across all imports, and that is effective from April 5th. As well as an additional reciprocal tariff with a specific list of countries that's been identified with a higher tariff ranging between 11 and 50%. The most notable being, of course, China, given the huge amount of imports that is coming in from China into the US, and of course, all of the discussion around the US and China. But this does not only involve products from China. It also impacts products from various different countries, including the European Union, including the UK, including other countries such as Vietnam, South Korea, Indonesia, India, countries where we know a lot of our clients are also importing or have products being manufactured from those countries. So effective from the 5th of April. However, the Trump administration has implemented a 90-day pause. So we are currently still in that 90-day timeframe where no additional changes are being implemented until the 9th of July. So as it stands at the moment, this is being applied and this will be applicable for imports. And we will wait to see until the 9th of July if there are any further changes to this or any reductions or increases to some of the percentages or the rates that have been applied. It is important to emphasize here, since the focus for us is the life sciences industry and very specifically clinical trials, that we are also aware that the Trump administration has made it known that they will be looking at the pharmaceutical industry quite closely. Whether this will affect clinical trials per se and all of the products that are being used as part of this research use is still to be discussed by the Trump administration and to be given more information when we do get to that point. But on the tariff system that they've introduced, so basically we have this baseline tariff of 10% that is applied on all imports. And that means that if the country is not listed on the specific Annexure 1, which we will show in a brief moment, then a basic additional 10% will be now applicable on anything that's being brought into the US. Now, just kind of speaking to the main commodities, especially being targeted, this is very much focused on automobiles, any type of parts relating to the automobile or the mobile industry, consumer type of products such as your electronics, technology items, apparel, and also textiles coming into the US. Currently, the exempt commodities, and Monique will touch on this in explicit detail in one of the slides that we'll bring up to show some of the HS codes that are still exempt. And these are typical commodities that we ship or that we import as part of the clinical trial space. But pharmaceuticals, medical devices, semiconductors, certain critical minerals such as oil and gas are still exempt. It is just goes without saying, but do check your HS codes. So if you are unsure, the administration has provided a very detailed list as Annexure 2 to their release that details all of the HS codes that are affected and exempt. The main objective here, as mentioned in the beginning of the session, is really to address the trade imbalance and specifically the deficits that exist between the US and the other countries. And the calculation of this rate basically indicates what that imbalance is. The bigger the imbalance between the US and a country, the higher this tariff rate will be and be applicable. So this is a summary of Annexure 1 and is also publicly available by the US administration. So this lists the country and the associated tariff rate that will be applicable. So if your product that you are importing has a country of origin for any of these countries, this will be the additional percentage in terms of a tariff that will be then applied, unless that commodity is exempt. So if you are importing a commodity that, let's say, does have Chinese country of origin, but it is currently under the exempt HS codes, then this will not be applicable, meaning this additional 34% will not be applicable, but the existing tariffs will remain in place. It does not mean that you will pay zero. It just means that this additional 34% that has been introduced in the beginning of April will not apply for the time being. I've highlighted there just a couple of important ones. So China being one of the more notable ones that's up for discussion and is in the news on a daily basis, which is at 34%. So if you are bringing in, for example, technology items, which if we're looking at clinical trials, if you are returning or importing type of ECOA devices, your smartphones, any wearables, then you need to be mindful of this additional 34% that will be attracted. And again, if you are bringing those devices in bulk, that could be quite a hefty cost that needs to be considered. The European Union is another one. Even though we are very much focused on the US-China relations at the moment, it's still important to be aware of the fact that any product with a European Union country of origin is also affected and has an additional 20%. Again, making that the case, since this is a percentage-based calculation, if any high-value commodity is anticipated or in your trial is planned to be imported into the US, it's really worth looking into what that additional cost will be, especially if you're thinking of anything higher than $100,000, then that impact from a cost perspective will be relatively significant. And then some of the other countries worth mentioning, Vietnam, for example, also having quite a high percentage at 46%. So again, be mindful of what products are being imported for your trial and then what the percentage would be and should it apply for those commodities. So when we just look at how this is being calculated, we want to try and keep this example very simplified, and this is based on assumptions. So again, don't take this as being applicable for all commodities coming from the UK and all commodities coming from China. We're really making a very baseline assumption here, or basic assumption here, to just provide an example of how the baseline versus the reciprocal tariff will apply, and depending on whether or not the country has been listed on Annexure 1 or not. If you are importing and if you do want a very exact calculation, do advise that you speak with either your importer of record or a tax consultant or even a broker to help advise and make sure that you're correctly classifying the commodity that you will be bringing in. So just for a quick clarification, you would have noticed on this Annexure 1 that the United Kingdom is not on this list. Now, that is just particularly because then the baseline tariff will only apply. So that means that the UK does not have this reciprocal tariff that applies, meaning that only the 10% baseline will apply. So let's take the example, we have an item that has a standard duty of 5%. Now it will have the additional 10% and bringing us to then a total duty of 15% that will then apply for this importation into the UK. If it is, let's say, a product with a country of origin from China, and it has an existing duty rate of 20%, now, given that China is on the list of countries for Annexure 1 and it has a 34% reciprocal tariff, that means that the total tariff and duty applicable will be the 20 plus the 34%. So an additional 54% is then attributable to that shipment. So just to show how the difference between baseline and reciprocal tariffs will work. I'll hand over to Monique to specifically touch on some commodities that are impacted, and these are commodities that we see on a daily basis for our clinical trials.
Perfect, great, thank you, Louisa. Yeah, so like Louisa mentioned, we specifically looked at the commodities within the clinical trial industry, as that is what we do focus on. So commodities that will be impacted by these additional reciprocal tariffs that was announced are, for example, firstly, your devices. So when you are importing fridges, freezers, or cooling boxes to the US, then those devices will incur these additional reciprocal tariffs. So it is important to note here, perhaps, if you are using the US as a distribution hub, for example, so let's say you have a fridge or a freezer that is shipping from the UK to the US for distribution to Latin America, let's say a site in Argentina, for example, it might be worth reconsidering that supply chain to rather import from the UK directly into Argentina and bypass that US warehouse or distribution center in that instance. So your devices will then be impacted by these commodity or by these tariffs. Then also any lab kits, so your invasive parts as well as any blood and tissue collection equipment. So they will incur these additional tariffs as well. Your patient materials that exclude paper. So any scarves, balls, plastic items, teddy bears, any patient recruitment materials, those items will also incur these additional tariffs. And then lastly, your plastic laboratory wear. So gloves, coats, protective eyewear, all of those laboratory wear will also incur these additional tariffs. But then on the other hand, and some good news, Annexure 2, which is also publicly available, does provide a comprehensive list of all the commodity types and specifically the HTS codes that are exempt from these additional tariffs. So they aren't only clinical trial related, there are quite a lot of other commodity types as well. But when specifically looking at clinical trials, your paper materials will be exempt. So these are your printed books, brochures, leaflets. So all your recruitment materials that are physically paper, they will be exempt. Then a very important one, as these are usually our very high value shipments that do incur a lot of duties and taxes, are your investigational medicinal products, your clinical supplies, or your drug products. So your HTS codes 3002, 3, 4, and 6, they are exempt from these additional tariffs as well. Even if they are shipping from China, they will be exempt from these additional tariffs. However, I do want to note here and reiterate as well, like Louisa mentioned, the Trump administration did note that they will be looking into the pharmaceutical industry. So this is as at today. And we will provide an update as soon as anything does change in terms of your medicinal products. And then any biological samples that are being returned back to the US, so back to a central lab for testing, for example, so tissue samples, blood samples, all of those samples that are shipped to the US will be exempt as well, which is great if your central lab is located in the US. And then the last item is returned items. So when you have a study where that is being completed and you need to return your equipment or your ECOA devices back to the vendor in the US, those items will be exempt from these additional tariffs. So if I do delve a little bit more into returned items, and we can go on to the next slide. Thank you, Louisa. Basically, there aren't any formal guidance confirming exactly which types of return goods will be fully exempt from these reciprocal tariffs. However, since these tariffs were announced, the TecEx Medical tax team has been consulting with US Customs to get a ruling in terms of how to treat your return goods. And what Customs has basically explained to us is that if product has been shipped, so let's say you have, for example, shipped an ECG machine to a site in Argentina from the US. So it has been exported out of the US, shipped to Argentina. It has been used there for 3 years by that site, and it is now just being returned back to the US. Then that returned item or that returned ECG machine will not incur these additional duties and tariffs. It is, however, very important to note that there are specific HS codes for returned goods. So it is important to either consult with your importer or an importer of record service provider or a brokerage service provider to support you with the correct HTS code classifications. Because a lot of times what can happen is the vendor can just classify the return shipment the same way that the shipment was classified when it was exported out of the US, and that code might still incur these tariffs. So it is important to make sure that you do apply the returned goods HS code to your items when they are being returned back to the US. Another important note is that these tariffs will only not be applicable if they was no substantial modification to the goods while they were outside in the US, because that does change what we call the rules of origin or the country of origin. So if we move on to the next slide, a country of origin is the location where a product undergoes its final substantial transformation. So basically where it's being completed for its primary function. So let's say we are building a laptop and we are getting components from a few different countries. If that laptop is being compiled and assembled within the United States will be considered the country of origin. If we make it practical in this instance and in terms of return goods, let's say we are shipping a device out of the US, so we're exporting to a site in Argentina, for example, and that device is being significantly changed in Argentina by a team there to enable the device to be used for that study, then that whatever has happened to that device in Argentina might change its country of origin. And then when that device is being shipped back to the US, it might incur the additional tariffs and charges. So what is important, and each scenario looks different, so we can't really provide examples for every scenario, but it's important in instances like that to either consult with TecEx or with any other importer of record or brokerage service provider to look at the specific scenario and get a ruling for that scenario in terms of whether the country of origin has changed, whether the product has been modified. And then if you are able to then prove that the product hasn't been modified and the country hasn't been changed, then you should be able to return the goods back to the US without incurring additional tariffs.
Right. So what that means in terms of implications for your study is specifically, I mean, the obvious higher import taxes, higher cost to your studies. And again, if this is on an ongoing study, it might be a surprise or additional increase that was not factored in. So we'll speak about how to try and calculate or how anticipating what these additional costs could be. Any regulatory uncertainties could also be a factor, as we see oftentimes when new tariffs or new tax structures are introduced, as well as how certain goods are classified. It is important to then be mindful that there may be certain delays happening at customs. So there will be a lot more scrutiny from the US, as well as from the other customs clearance and border controls regarding certain commodities coming into certain jurisdictions. Additional increased customs scrutiny, again, speaking to how goods are being classified, just the same way that all of us are wondering how to classify, how to, and what HS codes to apply to be able to get the lowest tariff. Everyone else is thinking the same, but customs is going to be looking out to make sure that you are actually using it in the right way. So just because a tariff attracts a lower percentage does not mean that you should be using it. Be careful in making sure that you are classifying your commodities correctly and compliantly so that you don't attract additional fines and delays at time of customs clearance. And then kind of leading into the last point of the risk of misclassification. It's exceptionally important to make sure that you have an experienced entity or team that can help with the classification of your commodities coming into, for example, the US. So not to just classify something based on a HS code that either your carrier or someone heard that can be used, and now they use that on your commercial invoice or on your pro forma invoice, but to vet that with a trade compliance team or with an entity such as TecEx Medical so that we can make sure that it's the correct HS code that needs to be leveraged. I do know we're on the half hour and some people will have to drop for some meetings. We're going to finish off with just some practical considerations, but we have recorded the session and we will also share this with everyone so that you can keep track of the last couple of minutes, and happy to share the slides as well. We have seen some questions and we'll address those directly with everyone to assess your scenario and the question that you've posed in the chat. Monique, I'll hand over to you for the last slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Louisa. So we're really just ending off with some practical considerations for your clinical trials. And it is important to distinguish in which life cycle your clinical trial is at. So is it a current clinical trial that is ongoing, or is it an upcoming trial where we can still plan upfront and make some changes? So the first consideration, the same for both. Very important to always start with the product list. So a list of all of the items that you are going to or that you are expecting to import into the US for your studies. And then from that list, get a consultant or an importer of record service provider or a broker that can help support in correctly classifying the HTS codes. Like Louisa mentioned, yes, we all want to classify the HTS codes that do attract the lowest tariffs and taxes, but it is important to classify your products compliantly so we can make sure that where lower taxes and tariffs are applicable and it is compliant, that we do classify in that regard. So then further to that, identify any upcoming shipments to the US and then shipments that will be returning to the US. So if you are on a current, or if you have a current study that is ending soon, it's very important to consider shipments that are returning back to the US, like I mentioned earlier, that those are being classified correctly in terms of the US return HS codes, so that additional tariffs are not incurred. Then if we move over to your upcoming trials, where you have then identified your imports into the US and the additional taxes or tariffs that will be incurred, it's important to work with vendors to see if they can source sensibly from different manufacturers or alternative manufacturers, but similar products. So let's say, for example, like we mentioned, we have our study in Argentina, or we have a study in the US rather, and we can either import goods that has been manufactured in the UK. So let's say our lab kits are manufactured in the UK, or we can just source our lab kits from a manufacturer that is already located in the US. Then it will make sense to rather source from the US directly instead of importing from the UK into the US. And lastly, it is important to calculate your estimated import taxes upfront, as that might have an impact on your supply chain, and it will also have an impact on your budget. So if you know upfront what these increased tariffs will have on your budget, then you can plan accordingly instead of having surprises when these taxes are being passed through by the carriers once the study has started. So that's just some practical considerations from our side. And that brings us to the end of our webinar and to the conclusion. So from my side, thank you so much to everyone that has joined. It was really great to speak to you all today, and we will be in touch with the questions that has been asked.
Thank you, everyone. And feel free to reach out to both myself or Monique for any additional questions. If you have any projects that you do want to explore your tax exposure or the calculation of potential tax impact, or just want to run a couple of scenarios past us, we're happy to engage in those discussions. Be on the lookout for more of these webinars. Hope to share some more of the insights of what we see and how it affects clinical trials. And hope everyone has a good rest of your afternoon or morning. Thanks, everyone.